mainly work in photography, but I also incorporate my different interests, such as theater, my interest in performance, my interest in literature, but also mainly my interest in sculpture.
Hello and welcome to Arts 24. Thank you for joining us here today. Now, you heard her voice just a second ago. She's an award-winning South African visual artist and photographer. She's also the 2024 winner of the Deutsche Börse prize. It's one of the most prestigious prizes in photography. Lebohang Kganye, thank you so much for joining us today. First of all, how did it feel to receive that prize, the Deutsche Börse prize?
Thank you for the invitation. I was extremely surprised, I must say. I think my practice has expanded so much over the last few years, and for it to receive the recognition it has at that level was beyond my expectations.
Now, you're here for a Paris Photo. It's the international photography fair held each year at the Grand Palais in central Paris. Now, this year, 240 exhibitors are present from 34 countries, 1,328 artists with 513 women. That's almost double the number than that in 2018. And one of the exhibitions that you have on display is called Keep the Light Faithfully from 2022. It's a sort of tribute, I guess, that you pay to the light keepers of South Africa by reenacting, reimagining their stories. Why light keepers?
That's a question that comes up quite a bit. So the last few years, I've been investigating my family name Kganye, which means light. And so my family name is spelled in these 4 different ways. And so I wanted to get to the sort of correct spelling, but also how that sort of ties to South Africa's history of migration, but, you know, languages that get erased through apartheid or through colonization, and names and histories of people and their identities. And so my family name became that route for me to investigate this, this sort of South African history. And it meaning light, somehow I ended up reading about lighthouses and became quite fascinated with some literature that was speaking about how within a Western context, in Europe particularly, there'd been over 300 female lighthouse keepers, which was very new for me. And so I then started to research whether there'd been lighthouse keepers in South Africa, female lighthouse keepers. And so that's how the story really began. And there'd never been any female lighthouse keepers. So these stories that I reenact is basically an imaginary female lighthouse keeper. So I almost embody the stories that all of these male lighthouse keepers that are currently in service in South Africa were telling me.
Now, you grew up in a township, I believe,
yes.
In post-apartheid South Africa, a very politically charged time to be living in South Africa. How do you think that upbringing influenced your art today?
So I think particularly coming to a space like the Market Photo Workshop, which is where I got my photography training. And it was started by the late photographer David Goldblatt, who had envisioned the space to be a space that gives people the sort of resources and the skills to be able to document their own communities during this apartheid period. And so it was very much focused on sort of a skills transfer. And so it was focused on people that come from townships and communities who would otherwise not necessarily have access to formal education, the resources to go into like formal training such for photography. And so I went into that institution post-apartheid when a lot of us young photographers were focusing not on what the older photographers were doing, which was mainly to document their communities and to document the atrocities of apartheid. For us, it was more issues of identity. And so being in that institution at that moment, was really crucial for me because I was able to bring in my interest in theater, in literature, which is very different to what the institution was actually based on. And so I was able to sort of ask all of these questions around my sort of post-apartheid identity, because I think a lot of us didn't know how to define ourselves because we've all sort of been defined through the lens of apartheid.
Now, you mentioned identity, history, colonial legacy, family history as well are all major themes through your work. And what's really interesting about your work is you explore it through mixed media. You just said it yourself, photography, but also light installations, life-size silhouettes, sometimes giving it a theatrical aspect as well. Why the choice to sort of deviate from just traditional classic photography and move into this kind of mixed media mode?
So I will always say that photography for me chose me. I think they're people that, choose the medium. So I wanted to become a writer. I've always known that I loved storytelling and literature. And so and a huge part of it has to do with, as I said, growing up in the sort of post-apartheid moment where now people of color and white South Africans are in a moment where now policies are saying they can exist in the same spaces. And so I went to a multiracial school in that moment during the sort of transition into democracy, and which was a really tough moment because we were denied to speak our languages at school. So we all had to speak English. And so obviously, I lost a lot of my sort of indigenous language. So,
Which is Sesotho.
Which is Sesotho, correctly.
Okay.
Correct. And so my work is always about the sort of interrogation of identity, of language, of erasure, of sort of, post-colonization identity, post-apartheid identity. And so because of that, I've always sort of had an interest in literature, but particularly in this idea of staging and how we sort of stage identities and selves. And so theater was always my sort of go-to from a very young age. So I started performing from the age of 14 within the theater space. And so that becomes, so my interest in theater and literature, in the moment where I ended up studying photography really by chance, I was able to bring in all of these different interests. And so that's why you see a lot of theatricality, I think, in the work.
Now, as I mentioned, you are the 2024 recipient of the Deutsche Börse Prize for the exhibition Haufi Nyana, I've Come to Take You Home. That exhibition is on display at Photography Museum in Amsterdam, and it actually is a collection of 4 of your bodies of work. Haufi Nyana means too close in your mother tongue, Sesotho. Mm-hmm. And one of the bodies of work that is part of that exhibition is Kelefalaka, which was produced in 2013. Actually one of your first, if not your first, series. It's an astonishing piece of art inspired by the death of your mother. You recreate scenes and poses of your mother that you found in old family photographs. Can you tell us how this came about, this project?
So 2010, my mom passed away, and 2012, I was in a moment where I was ready to sort of face loss and that loss. And so my research really with the family history and started in that moment. So I started to make this work after realizing, or really going through my mother's photo albums and realizing that a lot of the clothes that she was wearing were still in her wardrobe. And so this is 3 years after she'd passed on, but also these photos that I'm seeing are photos from when she was in her 20s and her 30s. So around the same age that I was when I started this project. And then I started to identify some of the locations where she'd been photographed and basically trace where she had been photographed and reenact these photos. So also it had a lot to do with my reality at the time of also becoming mother to my younger sister. So it was also the sort of embodiment of her as well, that I'd taken her role.
Passing of roles in a way.
Yes, exactly. But also to think about also how photo albums or family photo albums aren't necessarily a space of just recording memory, as they're also a space of recording sort of the imaginary and fantasy, in the sense that there weren't any photos of my mom in her factory worker's uniform, which is what she wore on a day-to-day. But all of the photos, she was very dressed up. And so I started to think about how the photo album almost becomes a space for the imaginary, and a space for also, I think, particularly in that moment when people are still producing family photo albums within the South African context, how a lot of them couldn't have the jobs that they would have ideally wanted to have, couldn't really become the selves that they wanted to be. And so the photo album represents who they would have probably wanted to be.
A form of self-expression in a way.
Exactly. Self-expression, but also self-imaginary to a large degree.
So just quickly, what's next for you now?
Oh, there's a lot. We've got some amazing shows coming up next year, amazing production. We've got a solo show with La Patinoire in Brussels in April, and I'm showing at their booth currently at Periphoto some of my new works.
Okay, well, so a lot to look forward to then, Lebohang. Let's thank you so much for joining us here on set on France 24. Let's leave you now with some images from another photographer who's on display at Paris Photo. And it seems very fitting just a few days after U.S. presidential elections. Michael Brody spent 10 years on the road in America. His work, Failing, is a testimony to the flip side of the American dream. It depicts the ravages of addiction, dependence, and death, but also the strange beauty of that comes from far-flung parts of America. We'll leave you with that. Thank you so much for watching. Stay with us, though. There's more news coming up on France 24.